Hey, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today's webinar. My name is Tony Buenger, and I'm a CMMC Provisional Assessor and CMMC Strategist at Redspin. Some of you know me in a previous lives, and I apologize for that. As you already know, or will soon find out, the CMMC certification process is a lot like a military minefield. It's always changing, can be difficult to navigate, and if you step in the wrong place, well, it can be pretty painful. So I hope to guide you through some of this today, even though it may be a very high level, but I know some of you are looking to get it more into some of the fundamentals on what it takes to get ready for CMMC certification. So today we're presenting maneuvering through the minefield of CMMC certification. So just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them in the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel. Our organizers will be monitoring them, and we will have time for questions at the end. So now, without further ado, let us get started. And we're going to get to the next slide here. Some of you may have seen this before if you've been to the CMMC-AB website. They recommend this path toward achieving certification. It provides a simple 10-step approach to preparing and achieving CMMC certification. So I've been using this model with my current CMMC clients, consulting them and preparing for their CMMC certification. So why reinvent the wheel? Let's use what the CMMC accreditation body put out there. So from a high level view, you can see that basically the first 5 steps can be considered the pre-assessment activities, while the last 5 steps can be considered actual assessment activities. So this is the way I like to break it down. So based on my experiences thus far with DoD contractors requiring certification, that many have opted to go through all 10 steps. So we'll talk about some of these in detail. Also, you can find more information on these 10 steps to certification on the CMMC-AB's website. So the first step is to understand the CMMC model and its requirements for the DoD contractor's targeted level of certification. We will spend most of our time on step 1 here because there are many activities involved in this first critical step here. The level of effort to prepare for an assessment can be sharply different per organization depending on its own situation. I mean, for example, a level of understanding of the CMMC model, some of the clients I've talked with, some are just starting, learning what an SSP is all about, while others have a very solid and mature SSP and are pretty close to being ready for the assessment phase. Also the maturity of the cybersecurity program of an organization, complexity of their organization and its IT network. Some companies are only 20 people, and some companies have 20,000 people, and that can really have some complexities with respect to preparing for a CMMC certification. Also, the availability of resources to prepare for a CMMC assessment. That is I'm seeing a lot of that, but many of us aren't used to having all the IT and cybersecurity resources in place as far as budgetary, as far as the skill sets, and we all need to do what we can to become CMMC compliant. So yeah, the list can go on, but those are some of the big items there. So let's go to the next slide and talk about the threat a little bit. It's important to understand why CMMC was created in the first place. Adversaries are targeting the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of sensitive government data, specifically federal contract information, also known as FCI, and controlled unclassified information, known as CUI, and this is happening throughout the entire defense supply chain. It's a target-rich environment, and adversaries have been successful exfiltrating CUI from DoD contractors. So as a result, every DoD contractor, whether a prime or sub, now required to get CMMC certification from an independent certified CMMC assessor to assess or evaluate the contractor's ability to protect the CUI and FCI. Specifically, the CMMC model, which we'll talk about a little bit later, was developed to require certification vice the old self-attestation, which did not work. So another reason why CMMC has come about. The following here is a recent example. I know many of you have been following here with the recent attack on Microsoft servers. You can see here that DoD contractors were targeted during this attack. It shows that adversaries are not just targeting the military weapon systems or large complex software systems that we know and love as the pure CUI, and in many cases classified, but we're also seeing that these adversaries are also focusing on exploitable targets such as the people and the facilities to make their way to this sensitive information. To be exact, they're making their way to the CUI. So the defense industrial base isn't the only target. Keep in mind here, you can see there's other targets there. You know, the theft of this information from all the nation's industrial sectors, not just the DoD, due to the cyber activity, is threatening national security as well as our economic security. So the intent of CMMC, in a nutshell, is to avoid future losses that we've been seeing. Some of these losses we've been seeing in the news. The famous one is the F-35. You know, so the purpose of CMMC is to protect this CUI and FCI to ensure that this does not happen again, or at least reduce the exfiltration of this data. The bottom line is that allowing these adversaries to continue to target and successfully exploit CUI hinders the nation's ability to maintain its strategic advantage. And we all know that we have a major adversary that is their strategy, national strategy, is to reduce our strategic advantage, competitive advantage. Okay, next slide, we're going to talk about the CMMC ecosystem. This surrounds the CMMC model, which we'll get to in a minute. But first and foremost, we need to remember that FCI and CUI must be protected, and the contractor must understand how to protect that data. That is what CMMC is all about. The data cannot be protected if the organization doesn't have a clear understanding of the nature of the data and how it should be handled and protected. You know, it's easier said than done, that many of you are finding out. The way I look at it is that the compliance model is secondary to the data. Yes, the compliance model is secondary to the data. The compliance model, such as the CMMC model, must be designed to ensure that it follows the data. You know where the data is, you know how to protect it. So with that, the success of the CMMC model depends on the contractor's understanding and ability to protect FCI and CUI while it's stored, processed, or transmitted within a controlled environment. The CMMC ecosystem is designed to bring all the players and these moving pieces together to ensure that all stakeholders have the resources needed to protect their environments. So let's dig a little bit deeper into the CMMC ecosystem. So we move to the next slide. So as I just said, there are many moving pieces that must work together to put CMMC into action to be effective for organizations to seek and attain their target level of certification. Some of the major pieces include oversight bodies, trainers, assessors, consultants, contractors, just to name a few. So these components make up the CMMC ecosystem and must work together to secure the defense supply chain. Specifically, this ecosystem is made up of 5 major categories of stakeholders. The first one, the top of the heap, is what's called reliant organizations. Right now, it's the DoD who's relying on its contractors to be CMMC, to have a CMMC certification to ensure it's properly protecting FCI and CUI. In the future, this may expand to other reliant organizations, other federal agencies. Organizations seeking certification, such as DoD contractors that require a targeted level of certification by the time of contract award. As of right now, OSCs are currently limited to the DoD, but we are seeing that potentially this is expanding to other federal agencies, and some of you may have seen that in the news. But right now, we're just focusing on the DoD. We're trying to get our house in order first. The third one here, major component, is service provider organizations. These are pretty much your C3PAOs and RPAOs. They pretty much serve as the interface between the reliant organizations and the individuals performing services, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. The service provider organizations, such as a C3PAO, typically hire individuals performing services, known as assessors, or practitioners. They can be either full-time employees or hired as contractors, and many of you are already seeing that happen today. Also note that the SPOs are listed in the CMMC marketplace, which we'll talk about a little bit later in this webinar. So next slide, we'll talk about the individuals performing services. This is your registered practitioner, your certified professional, or your certified assessor. While there may be a fourth designation you've been hearing about, the provisional assessor, remember that it's only temporary, as it expire 6 months after the end of this provisional period, where the certified assessor will be the only authorized IPS to lead CMMC assessments. So right now we're still in a provisional period. You've been probably seeing some news today about those first 15 contracts being delayed again. So so it looks like the schedule's changing again. So now that your head hurts from all these spinning alphabet soup I've thrown at you, IPS, RPO, we're going to look at how they interact with each other. Next slide, please. So the intent of this eye chart is not to make your head and eyes hurt, but visually depict the high-level interaction between the key players within the CMMC ecosystem. It's important to understand your relationship between the key stakeholders. So pick your spot on here, whether you're an OSC on here, you're in the upper right corner. If you're an RPO, if you're another assessor, look at where you sit on this map here, and you can look at the interactions that you may have with all the other key players. Keep in mind that the CMMC ecosystem was designed to be as decentralized as possible to reduce cost for the OSCs to attain and maintain CMMC certification. Keep in mind that there's a big cost to obtain the certification, but there's also costs associated with maintaining that CMMC certification. Even though there's a 3-year certification period, you still need to ensure that that certification is maintained. There's still much work to be done in this area, and too much of it to go into in this webinar on how all these interactions take place. So we're just going to tackle one of these one at a time here at a high level. You can see that the CMMC-AB is at the heart of the ecosystem. Yeah, you can see up the top, not the very top, that's the DoD, but you got the accreditation body there. You know, in a sense, I see the CMMC-AB like a traffic cop whose responsibility is to ensure that the CMMC ecosystem is as viable as possible for all stakeholders involved. So the CMMC manages the ecosystem and ensures that the stakeholders are operating in accordance with ethical and professional guidelines. And some of you heard this before. Note that the CMMC-AB is not a doer. It doesn't conduct assessments. It no longer conducts training, and it doesn't provide consulting services. That's left up for the SPOs and the IPSs. So CMMC-AB also ensures that the assessments are performed objectively and they meet all CMMC guidelines. And so let's not forget the OSCs who are stuck way off to the far right of this eye chart. I mean, many of you on this webinar, I believe, are OSCs. So you're looking to you're seeking certification. And you can see on here, you will be working with all stakeholders within the CMMC ecosystem to prepare and get your certification. You'll be working with eventually a C3 PAO. You'll be working with certified or provisional assessors. You may be working with registered provider organizations and the registered practitioners to prepare for the assessments. So you'll be working with all these, and it's very important to understand the interrelationships between all these. So next slide, please. We'll go on to the actual model. So most of you, I'm sure you've seen this model before, but I want to be sure that we do level set here. So you've heard me mention CMMC model quite a few times already, and we're just going to dig into it a little bit more. Note that we are still on step 1 of the 10-step path to certification. Yes, we're still on step 1. As you can see, step 1 can be very time and resource intensive, as it requires stakeholders with all contractors organizations to understand their individual role within the CMMC assessment process for becoming certified. There's a lot of activity that goes into step 1. So let's talk about understanding the CMMC model here, which is a big part of step one. We won't go into detail here, but we'll discuss the four major components of the CMMC model, which are domains, capabilities, practices, and processes, along with this concept called maturity, which gives CMMC its unique flavor. So we'll go into detail about that. So quickly, domains. There's sets of capabilities that are based on cybersecurity best practices. There are 17 of these security-related domains within the CMMC model. Now, if you're familiar with NIST SP 800-53 and NIST 800-171, then you're already familiar with these domains, such as access control, audit and accountability, incident response, personnel security, and I can go on for the other 14 if you like, but I won't. So during an assessment, each domain is evaluated for practice and process implementation and a maturity across 5 maturity models. That's a mouthful, but basically keep in mind that practices, for all intents and purposes, can be thought about as implementation of security controls. The practices are activities that an organization does to manage their operational resilience. So most of these CMMC practices, some of you may have found out, is derived from this SP 800-171, but not all of them, and we'll talk about that shortly. Finally, to get to the processes, what are these processes all about? You know, the processes are activities that make the practices stick, even when an organization is under stress. So if an organization loses some significant fraction of its skill sets, can they continue on? Can they continue on with their business and ensuring that the business is continuing and that they're still properly protecting their sensitive data? So that's what processes are looking for, and we'll talk about that shortly here. Next slide, please. So this is a graphic adapted from the CMMC model. Many of you may have seen this before. So no matter what level of exposure or involvement in the CMMC model or ecosystem that you may have, you've probably seen some form of this diagram before. As you can see, it kind of matches up the practices versus the processes and how they progress throughout the 5 levels of maturity. As I mentioned at the top of this webinar, it's important for the contractor or the OSC to understand that CUI and FCI must be protected accordingly. The rigor of this data protection increases as the maturity level increases. As you can see on both sides of this chart, as you go from level 1 to level 5, you can see just from the names for the practices and for the processes, how the rigor in the maturity level increases. For certification purposes, let's note, I still hear this from some clients talking about getting a level 2 certification. There is no level 2 certification. So for certification purposes, there are only 3 levels of certification, levels 1, 3, and 5. Now, however, the DoD is not ready for level 5 yet. Some of you have heard that they're getting ready to get the level 5 certification process defined, but right now levels 1 and 3 certification processes are well defined, and we'll talk about a little bit later about where you can find the requirements for those. So as you can see from this diagram, another important point from this diagram is understanding that protecting FCI only requires compliance with CMMC levels 1 and 2. Compliance with levels 1 and 2. Say that again, certification for FCI is level 1. CMMC level 3 requires more rigor, and in which we'll dive to in a little bit more detail here, since requires a lot more involved. There's a lot more involvement when it comes to becoming level 3 compliant or certified. Next slide, please. So what do we mean by process maturity? This is what CMMC brings to the fight. It brings 171 to the fight. It brings the DFARS to the fight for level 1. It brings some other standards into the fight. But what's this process maturity all about? So basically the concept of maturity is based on meeting the requisite implementation of practices and the processes for a particular maturity level. So the intent here is to measure the institutionalization of the practices and processes. Okay, I fumbled on that word institutionalization. Okay, I think I got it right this time. So basically what an assessor will do is come in and look at the maturity level of your cybersecurity program. And keep in mind, they're not just looking at the IT department or the cybersecurity department. They're looking at, does this organization have matured business processes to ensure that they are adequately protecting FCI and CUI, mostly CUI. Level 1 doesn't have this maturity requirement, but level 2, level 3, level 4, and level 5 do. So basically, the term institutionalization characterizes the extent in which an activity is embedded or ingrained in the operations of an organization. The key terms here is ingrained in the operations of an organization. We'll get into that a little bit later, what that means. It's not just the implementation of technical controls. So they must demonstrate both the requisite institutionalization of processes and the implementation of practices. Remembering that practices can be equated to security controls that we know and love, such as multi-factor authentication, implementing a firewall, blah, 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 those type of things. So institutionalizing processes takes time. Remember that it does take time. Some of you have been finding that out. In some cases, organizations' culture can be a hurdle in receiving certification. The culture can get in the way. So basically, which some organizations are running into, and this is throughout the organization, it's not within the IT department, cybersecurity department. Remember, this must be embedded or ingrained in the operations of an organization. So many of you may be running into that concept, that syndrome called, we've always done it this way before, so why do we have to change? And that can get your company into trouble, because to meet a level 3 or higher certification, you will have to clearly prove that you have institutionalized your processes throughout the organization. Next slide, please. So we'll delve a little bit deeper into the practices and processes. The CMMC model lays out a progression of practices for each of the 17 domains to allow OSCs to build their cybersecurity program to meet CMMC compliance. So it's important to understand the cumulative nature of the CMMC model. If you do your handy dandy math, you will calculate that level 3 requires implementation of 17 level 1 practices plus the 72 level 2 practices plus 41 of its own level 3 practices. Now, hopefully I did that math right. I think I did it right. So if anyone, keep me honest here. So if I didn't, just let me know. Anyway, the point here is that it's cumulative. To be level 3 compliant, to conform with level 3, you got to be level 1 and level 2 as well. But you get the point. As previously mentioned, the rigor of the practices increases as the level of maturity increases, as you can see here. Next slide, please. We'll go back to process maturity. As you can see, the model also provides a progression of maturity processes to ensure that these practices that have been implemented are repeatable and lasting. It means if you input A, you should always get B, right? It's repeatable, and usually do this through documented procedures and published policies and documented procedures. Note that the CMMC processes are not a part of the FAR or DFAR's requirements. These are specifically an addition to the CMMC model. It will not be found in this SP 800-171 or any other compliance resource here. So just as with the progression of practices, the progression of processes, what's a mouthful, builds for each level and is designed to provide assurance that practices are repeatable and lasting. Okay, you're hearing repeatable and lasting many times. That's the kick stomper here, is CMMC model is not a checklist approach. You've heard that before from the DoD. This is ensuring that, okay, you checked off all your security controls through the implementation of practices, but are you truly managing them? And that's at a minimum level 3 that you need to prove that you institutionalized your processes. So basically, the intent of the processes is to demonstrate maturity of the OSC's cybersecurity program as it relates to the protection of FCI and CUI. Now, we don't have enough time in this webinar to take a real deep dive into these 5 processes to provide the underlying foundation for ensuring that the practices are implemented and managed at the appropriate level, whether it's level 2, 3, 4, or 5. But I think you get the point here that you need to know where you are, what is your targeted level of certification, and what do you need to do to not only implement the practices, but to also ensure that you've institutionalized processes that are lasting and repeatable. Now, these processes are things such as policies, documented procedures, things that you do over and over again in a managed way. Next slide, please. So in a nutshell, it will take time to properly plan for the actual CMMC assessment. This is why we're still in step 1 of the 10-step process. You can see you need to understand all these intricacies and ins and outs of the CMMC model and its requirements. The CMMC accreditation body constantly foot stomps, as you can see from their graphic here, that it will take time to prepare for the formal CMMC assessment for certification. It will require active involvement of a large portion of the contractor's organization, if not all employees from within the organization. As I said at the top of this webinar, it depends on the size and complexity of your organization. But as I said before, this must be ingrained in the operations of your business. So meeting the full intent of the CMMC practices and processes requires that the cybersecurity be threaded throughout the organization. It's not just an IT or cybersecurity only endeavor. Next slide, please. So we're finally going to move into step 2. So we're moving from step 1. As you can see, step 1 is very involved. Take time to grasp the model and its requirements. Step 2 requires the contractor to scope the environment in order to reduce the footprint for the assessment. However, going back to what I said at the top of the webinar again, and by now you're detecting a pattern here, scoping is primarily about ensuring that FCI and CUI are properly contained to limit access and control of the data to authorized users. So basically what this means is you got to scope your environment, your network, people trained to ensure that they are properly protecting FCI and CUI. And it's not intermingling with the general administration portion of your business. One note of caution, however, scoping in the context of making the CMMC assessment less complex is not the primary objective. You can get into trouble if you're just focusing on what can we do to make scoping easier for our CMMC assessment. Remember, that's secondary. The primary objective is to ensure that FCI and CUI are adequately protected based on CMMC guidance and requirements. So in other words, know where your data lives, understand how to protect it, and understand how to process, store, and transmit it within a secured environment. So next slide, please. So let's dive a little bit deeper into scoping. Scoping defines the boundaries where FCI and CUI are stored, processed, and exchanged, transmitted within the DoD contractor's environment, within the OSC's environment. So first and foremost, we're here to protect the data. Secondarily, scoping will reduce the footprint for the CMMC assessment, but the operative word here is secondarily. Note that at this time, and many of you who know this, there is no official guidance on how to scope an environment for protecting FCI and CUI while it's stored, processed, and transmitted. The DoD is expected to put out official scoping guidance sometime in the near future in the next version of the CMMC assessment process. I'm hearing it's going to be in the next version of the CMMC assessment guides. It should be in the CMMC assessment guide for level 1, assessment guide for level 3, and the assessment guide for level 5. So we should see some scoping guidance. But in the meantime, we got to make do with what we think it will cover. I'm hoping that at least well before the summer, and the summer's approaching, we're going to get some clearly defined guidance on scoping from the DoD. I mean, we'll see, but in the meantime, you know, we're kind of flying blind without this clear, consistent guidance on scoping. Next slide, please. So you may have seen out there various independent scoping concepts as a reference, and it's good to use those. They're all useful at this time. In my previous organization where I worked, I was helping that organization work on their CMMC Level 3 certification. We developed basic scoping diagram based on what we knew intuitively, you know, for protecting, building a secure enclave to protect CUI. But since then, we've seen more detail put in the concept of scoping. You can see companies such as Compliance Forge, the PCI, they've actually come up with some detailed scoping as well. It's good to use anything that you can find. You're going to see that they're not far off from each other, but really a lot of organizations have put hard work into this. And in scoping, the bottom line here is no matter what model you use, what model's out there, if you come up with your own, scoping requires a lot of detailed planning to get it right. Much of it depends on proper network segmentation to start off. We're not going to get into a lot of detail here. It's outside the scope of this webinar, but until DoD guidance comes out, do what you can to understand how to scope your environment. It's very important to do that before it comes time for your assessment. So next slide, please. So basically just one little bit more deep, let's go a little bit deeper into the scoping. The design for each zone, and basically if you look at all the models that's been independently built out there, they've pretty much done it based on the zone concept. But the zone, the complexity of your scoping obviously is going to depend upon your organization's size, its network complexity, contractual requirements. You know, do you have a lot of reliance on managed service providers? Are you all on premise, hybrid, everything off, you know, everything off into the cloud? You need to clearly understand those implications before you can really understand how to scope. One thing that I've seen across all these scoping models is zone 1 is usually designated as your secure enclave. That's where all the CUI happens. That's where CUI, FCI is stored, processed, and transmitted. Now keep in mind, CUI and FCI, you can have 2 separate zones for that. They can commingle. Once again, it all depends upon your organization. But as you can see in that arrow, red arrow there, that red box, that's what I call ground zero. That is where all the sensitive data is happening. All the CUI is happening. The other zones are designed to either protect the data from unauthorized access or to ensure access to authorized users as appropriate. So you're going to see you've got your standard network segmentation, you got your security support tools, you know, you got your SIM, things like that. You got contractors out there. This is one of the first things you need to do after determining what level of certification you need, that you identified in step 1. Next slide, please. So now that you know everything there is to know about scoping, right. Next, we're going to talk about the targeted level of maturity. You know, as of right now, there are only 2 certifications, level 1 and level 3, that we're potentially seeing in contract language. However, the DoD is hard at work at getting the level 5 certification process ready. That example I gave you, that Microsoft compromise breach that you saw earlier, that's from what I'm seeing is one of the catalysts in driving the DoD to get level 5 certification ready. Because if you really dug deep into these 5 levels, level 5 really targets and focuses on protection from APTs, advanced persistent threats, and that's what that Microsoft breach was all about. It was basically an APT. Next slide, please. So before stepping any further out into the minefield, the contractor, also known as the OSC, needs to know the targeted level of certification. You pretty much know that during step one, but now you're applying the CMMC model to it. So what does this mean? I'm told through contractual requirements that I must be a level 3. Now, what does that mean? So this is a step where you're going to look at what does that mean? So the contractors I've talked to, we've been talking to some small contracting companies who believe since they're small that they only require CMMC level 1. And some of you out there who are an RPO or C3PO or provisional assessor on this webinar I've surely run into this as well. So that's a misnomer that we need to clear up now. Just because you're small does not mean that you are required to achieve only CMMC level 1 certification. I found us out after looking at their contractual requirements, the tasks they perform, that they were clearly needing to achieve CMMC level 3 certification, since their tasks, their contract tasks involved storing, processing, and transmitting CUI. Well, look at that diagram up there. That's a minimum of level 3. So once we establish that with the OSC, we start looking at what does that mean for them to achieve level 3 certification. So the bottom line is that the maturity level of certification is not based on the size of the company, but it's based on the data that needs to be protected. And that's what that chart shows. It's a very, very good chart to keep handy, that chart up there that you see. I use that quite a bit. Next slide, please. So what are some of the examples between CUI and FCI? I still get this a lot. FCI, federal contract information. Basically, it's on a contract consisting of FCI and there's no CI involved. Well, what does that really mean? Well, FCI is basically you're providing services such as food delivery services via a DoD contract to deployed military units. You don't want the adversary to get information that some military units suddenly deployed to a certain portion of the world, and they find out through the fact that suddenly there was this new contract that's sending a bunch of food to this one portion of the world. So you need to protect that information. Facility janitorial services or military installations, it may seem innocuous at this point, but putting these pieces of the puzzle together can really get the adversary the information that they need to eventually get to CUI just by exposure from FCI. Now moving on to CUI, level 3 examples. Remember, level 3, CUI, it's based on contracts consisting of CUI and possibly FCI. But keep in mind, this is the hardcore. OSC manufactures parts for military aircraft, Navy ships, so to speak, all those type of tanks. OSC also develops, stores, prints, blueprints for DoD units or other DoD contractors. Remember, we've got primes and subs involved here. So you can see where the difference is here and how compromising FCI can potentially lead to a compromise of CUI, how they're interrelated. So now, moving on. Let's see, we're moving on a little bit quickly here than we did from step 1. And once you know what level of certification you're targeting, now you can start identifying the gaps. This is what step 4 is about. Based on my experiences so far, I've been working this for about a year now, specifically working to get OSCs ready for CMMC certification. They're opting to hire consultants to help identify gaps. You don't have to do this, but this is a recommendation. Note that it doesn't need to be a CMMC-AB vetted RPO or C3PAO to provide pre-assessment consulting services. It's just recommended you do that because there was some vetting involved in that, but it's not required. Just be sure that you are hiring consultants who have hands-on experience evaluating DoD environments requiring FCI or CUI protection. So if you come across anyone who's been doing DoD assessments for many years using NIST framework, cybersecurity framework, using NIST 800-53, 800-171. These folks have been doing it for many years, then you probably got the right person to help you. Next slide, please. So we're identifying these gaps. I recommend a two-phased approach. First, conduct an internal self-assessment, then hire an independent consultant to conduct a pre-assessment. I'll say that again. First, you conduct an internal self-assessment to understand where you think you are, then hire an independent consultant to conduct a pre-assessment to verify where you think you are, or more than likely, find out you missed some things. Sometimes you just can't see the forest through the trees. So my recommendation is, conduct your internal self-assessment. Use the resources provided to you. I will cover those on the next slide. Involve all stakeholders. Once again, there were more stakeholders involved than just the IT gurus or the CISO or the CIO. You're going to find that out. You're going to need all your key stakeholders. Make sure you identify them and get them involved. Know where your data flows. This goes back to make sure you know you have your environment scoped. Once again, there it is. Know your assessment boundary based on the scoping. Develop, update your SSP to include the scoping diagram and networking diagrams. You can see how all this builds upon each other, and build that POAM. Now remember, to get a CMMC certification, you're not allowed to have POAMs. Keep in mind, we're not talking that POAM. This POAM has helped you identify your internal gaps so you can remediate those gaps and close out this POAM. Your POAM, when they say you cannot have a POAM, that means from your assessment, you cannot have any open items when you get your formal CMMC assessment for certification. So a benefit of hiring an independent consultant, once you've done your internal self-assessment, to have an independent consultant come in to do a pre-assessment, they can provide you that objective perspective. They can see the forest through the trees. They haven't gotten in the middle of the trees yet and seen all those ugly trees. And they've had experience. More than likely, hopefully, as an OSC, you've hired NIST-based experience, or have done a lot of NIST-based assessments, because let's face it, most of your self-assessment is going to be based on 171. Next slide, please. So these are the three important resources I would recommend you look at. I won't go at them in detail. Some of you have probably seen them by now. Of course, you've got NIST SP 800-171, which is going to provide you with a good large percentage of the security controls, 110 of them for level 3, starting at level 3, all 110. The NIST SP 800-171A is a good reference. The A stands for assessment. It's really designed for assessors to use to assess your compliance with 171 revision 2 there on the left. Now, to apply CMMC, I highly recommend you get comfortable with your level of your assessment guide. If you're targeting level 1, then get the level 1 CMMC assessment guide. If you're targeting level 3, then likewise get very comfortable with CMMC assessment guide level 3. We can do a whole nother 2 or 3 hours just on the assessment guide itself, but we won't have time to do that. Next slide, please. I just wanted to talk about this point here. I've said it before, is that this is not strictly an endeavor for IT and cybersecurity teams within the organization. Stakeholders from across the organization are involved in CMMC compliance. Now, I put this example up here just to show that you can see the difference. The assessment guide breaks out the processes versus the practices. Now, if you notice in the processes, look at some of the stakeholders there. You have human resources involved, and personnel security. In physical protection, you have facility managers involved. You have all kinds of different people involved just in these two domains itself, personnel security and physical protection. So keep this in mind, that you need to get all these folks involved. One thing that I'm finding is many of these folks feel that if you document all your policies and procedures, you're good to go. For these processes, especially this level 3 process, which is, you can see down here, PE.3.997, Your executive team here, as you see on the right, CEO, CFO, HR, CISO, they need to be very familiar with the processes, the institutionalized processes, as we talked earlier in step 1. What they're all about is those are the folks who are driving the strategy and guidance for the overall CMMC program. Next slide, please. So you're going to close any gaps here. Once you identify them, you're going to close and remediate those gaps. Next slide, please. So just as in step 4, this can be done internally or via an independent consultant to assist with the remediation. So once again, you've heard this before, OSC should plan ahead with respect to remediation. Some remediation efforts could take 2 weeks, while some could take many, many months, especially for a level 3 certification. So remember, the CMMC assessment process does not allow any open items. So any gaps must be remediated. Next slide, please. So now you've finally reached, you finished all your pre-assessment activities, you think you're ready to go, and now you're ready to go find a C3 PAO to conduct your formal assessment. Next slide, please. So one note here to make before a C3 PAO can conduct an assessment, they also must successfully complete a CMMC maturity level 3 assessment conducted by the DCMA, DIBCAC, oh, there goes that alphabet soup again, stands for the Defense Contracting Management Agency. It's their Defense Industrial Base Cybersecurity Assessment Center that will conduct a formal CMMC level 3 assessment on C3 PAOs. You've heard there's about 100, maybe 97 right now approved C3 PAOs, but they're not authorized to conduct assessments yet. I think the first one was March 10th, and that should be wrapping up by now. So the first one, hopefully, they pass the CMMC level 3 assessment, and they will be authorized to start conducting those assessments. Also, the provisional assessor must already have a tier 3 background suitability check, which from what I'm hearing takes an estimated 6 months to complete. I know I started my process as a provisional assessor back in, I believe, November, submitted the form, been talking with the security person at CMMC-AB, and I still haven't gotten that completed yet. Now, we as a C3 PO at Redspin, we are scheduled for our CMMC level 3 assessment during the week of May 10th. So we're happy, or maybe happy is not the right word, but we believe we're ready for that, and it's going to be a very interesting experience as we go through that. Keep in mind that C3 PAOs can be found on the CMMC marketplace, and as these C3 PAOs do become certified, you'll be able to tell as an OSC when you go searching for a C3 PAO to have your assessment done. You'll be able to tell which ones are authorized and which ones are still candidates, meaning they haven't gone through the CMMC assessment process to be certified. Next slide, please. So we're about ready to wrap up here, and no, I didn't fat finger the circle here. I intentionally circled steps 7 through 10. These are basically high-level conceptual steps of the overall CMMC assessment process. So there's no need to go into these in detail. The provisional assessor will take you through this detail, or the consultant will take you through the detail of the assessment process. The provisional assessors are provided detailed training on the CMMC process. So provisional assessors should have that detailed process, but keep in mind that the assessment process, which is also called assessment methodology, but from my understanding, the term is phasing away from assessment methodology to assessment process. The provisional assessors have access to the process, and as I said earlier, keep in mind that this process is still evolving. So we all need to be mindful of some of these changes happening. But in any respect, the PAs will lead the OSC through the assessment process during consulting, right, during the pre-assessment, help them understand what that process is. Then you're going to have the PA or the certified assessor post-provisional period take the OSC through the assessment process for the actual certification assessment. So the OSC will become, if you do hire a consultant for pre-assessment, they should be helping you understand what the assessment process will take you through. So once the assessment starts, the CMMC process will take the key parties, like I said, through all the phases. Right now, there's 4 major phases for completing that assessment. And if everything goes right, the OSC will achieve its targeted level of certification. And with that, you've gone through those 10 steps. Next slide, please. So that wraps up our webinar for today, and we will now open up for some of your questions in our final 10 minutes.
Hey, Tony.
Hey.
I've got a question from the audience. That question is there a more detailed list that can help a company decide if they should be level 1 or level 3?
That's a good question. First and foremost, your determination of certification level will come from your contract, from the contractual requirements. So if let's just take an example, you're bidding on a contract. That contract will flow down those requirements to you. So the contract will say, if you're going to bid on this portion of this contract, it will involve you storing, processing, and transmitting CUI. Therefore, you will be CMMC level 3. If you're performing just some services like the janitorial services, that contract will also specify that and tell you that this is at CMMC level 1. So in theory, and I repeat, in theory, it's not up to the OSC to determine their level of certification. The contract requirements will dictate the certification. Now, what I've been seeing is I ask the company, what do they do? Okay, what do you do? Okay, I manufacture parts for this tank. Well, yeah, that's CUI. That's clearly CUI. So you're going to be a minimum level 3. And so let's target level 3 until you can validate through your contractual requirements. If you say, well, we just clean up the gym on the military installation, well, that's CI. Maybe it's not. FCI definitely doesn't go up to the level 3. So that's what we need to play with right now. Until you understand which contract that you will be bidding on, you will not know for sure, but you can tell by the nature of your business. So I hope that answered your question.
Okay, we have another question. In the resources, why wasn't NIST SP 800-172 not mentioned?
That's a good question because we haven't gotten that far yet. I know that's just coming into play, but at this point, and I mentioned this earlier, that the CMMC assessment methodology or process, as they're calling it now, from my understanding, will be changing and being updated. From my understanding, NIST 800-172 may be a part of that. I do not know that. What I will do, I know it's talking. So once we start talking 172, because basically what 172 is enhanced security requirements, right? It really embellishes on the 171 to better target the advanced persistent threat. And we're seeing more talk about that because as a reaction, it's not the only reason why they're doing this, but going back to the Microsoft breach example. So I would suspect that the next version of the CMMC assessment process will include the 171 requirements. Now, at what level? I'm hearing level 4 and 5, and so I'm mostly focusing on level 1 and 3 here. But if anyone knows anything different, I'll be glad to hear what your thoughts are. But I'll definitely get back to you on what the latest of 172 is.
Okay, and another one. If a company wants to proactively pursue level 1 certification, but does not handle CUI or FCI, how would they scope the effort with no data to protect or segment? Is this possible? And would this need to be generalized certification of the entire infrastructure?
I'm not aware of any generalized, but when you're talking level 1, You have to assume you're protecting FCI. Now let's keep in mind, there is, earlier I mentioned that this may not be a DoD only endeavor. One of those 15 contracts is from the Defense Health Agency. Okay, so now you got Defense Agency who's in the healthcare sector. Well, they're dealing with a lot of PII and PHI. So where does that fit? I know there's been talk with that particular contract that they're not seeing CUI, but they're seeing PII. And there's discussion about, is PII actually level 1 or level 3? But to answer your specific question, I would go with FCI level 1, which is those 17 practices. Now those are simple level 1 practices that's called your basic cyber hygiene. If you cover those, you should be good to go. I mean, there's not a lot of effort. We didn't talk about level of effort between level 1 and level 3, but there's a significant difference in level of effort between the two. I recommend you go through those 17 practices, which are actually 15 safeguarding requirements from DFARS. So I would look at those, just look at those 17 practices in the CMMC assessment guide for level 1 and see where that takes you.
Okay. Will or are CMMC certification requirements extended to organizations that provide cybersecurity services to the DoD?
That's a good question. Cybersecurity services to the DoD. Now, what do you mean by DoD? I know it's hard. We don't have a two-way conversation here, but provide cybersecurity services to the DoD. Need to know what that is. Consulting services, is that as a managed service provider? And it's going to depend on what your role is. And if we got into the details of scoping, that could determine where you fit into the overall scoping environment. Are you a third-party vendor? Are you a managed service provider? Are you an actual contractor? Considered a contractor? That will all really help define your scope. So it's hard to answer that question, but if you're providing cybersecurity services, I think you're talking about managed service provider. Are you providing SIM services? If you are, depending upon the type of organization you are, you could end up being in scope for a CMMC assessment. More than likely, from what I'm gathering just in the general terminology of cybersecurity services, you'll probably be in scope. If you're providing direct security services, like as a SIM type thing, or you're monitoring their border protection, such as SecureWorks does, you'll definitely be in scope there, and you're going to have to follow their CMMC level certification. You'll be within their scope.
How about specifically consulting services, Tony?
Yeah, consulting services, once again, that all is going to depend upon, first, are you directly accessing, are you directly storing, processing, transmitting CUI or FCI? And if you're not, do you have any direct connection into that secure enclave? Meaning that if you have to log into a system within that secured enclave that processes CUI, then you are in scope. Then you're going to have to follow those level 3 requirements. You will be within there. You definitely be in scope for that. There could be some indirect connections in there. So that's where, as I said, scoping can take a lot of time. As an OSC, you need to look at all your partners. And in this example, cybersecurity services, those type of things, they're your partners. And in many cases, they will be in scope for the assessment.
And to clarify, what about like a help desk that's 100% of the time at a government location?
Yeah, that once again, it's all going to depend on what accesses does that help desk have. Do those help desk technicians, do they have access? Do they log in to devices that can get access inside the enclave? If so, then they are in scope. If not, if there's no way for them to touch any of those systems within that secure enclave, if there's no way they can log in, no access at all, then they're out of scope. And that's why you got to be very clear in the scoping, very clear. You may have 2 help desks. You may have 1 help desk that's within your secure enclave. For all those folks who's processing, storing, transmitting CUI, then you have the other help desk just for the general admin in your your normal business operations. So once again, scoping can be very time consuming and in some cases require re-architecting your environment.
I think that's it for questions. We're at the top of the hour.
All right, thanks for those questions. The only one that I really didn't have a good answer on was on the NIST 172 issue. As you know, that's very fluid right now, and I will get more information on that, and we'll get back to you with that answer. So I wanted to quickly mention that we have some additional resources at our site here that you can go to. Visit redspin.com, to listen to our podcasts we have on CMMC topics, the latest news, latest and greatest. So this concludes the webinar. Thank you for joining us, and watch for a follow-up email containing this presentation. And don't hesitate to reach out to me. My email is on here, anthony.buenger@redspin.com, for any more questions or comments, or just talk about the weather. And if you're down here in the Southeast, you don't want to talk about the weather here lately. I'm going to be dodging tornadoes here later tonight. So with all that, I bid you fair adieu, and we'll get back to you.